maybe the whole United States with regard to licensing. How about around here? Yes, sir.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Bill, for inviting me. And hello to all of you here at Bill's class. Isn't it great? Doesn't he make you feel comfortable, relaxed? It's going to be a breeze, right? Yeah, I heard you all there as those numbers were selected. I heard those sighs. But that's good. You need that kind of experience. I wish I had had that when I was in an undergraduate program, because really what you're getting is just a small taste of what the real world is going to be like out there, and it's changed a lot. And certainly that point about presentation is very critical today. Communication skills are essential. And more so than you even realize, than they have been in the past, is because today it's all about being able to communicate effectively, not only in raising money, but running your business, making money with your business, and a whole host of things. And coming here to speak to you today about strategy is actually a really appropriate place to be, because what I want to share with you today is something that is all about strategy, yet it's something that is not covered in just about any college or university. Most textbooks don't even discuss it, and that is intellectual property and licensing. Now, how many of you are familiar with intellectual property? A few of you. You know patents, trademarks, copyright. What about licensing? What it is? Very few. Not surprising, because it's just not covered, yet it has become such a critical component of business today all around the world. Every country in the world is involved with it, every business. It's at the forefront of the valuations of companies that you're seeing skyrocketing today, and it's creating enormous wealth all around the world. It's also creating competitive advantages, competitive disadvantages. Companies are built with it, and companies fall apart with it. So let me start with a question. What do these companies all have in common? I gave you a clue just a minute ago.
A brand?
That's close.
A trademark?
That's close. Intellectual property and licensing. You see? Every one of these companies was built on intellectual property and licensing, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit. But it's more than you realize as you look at around you. And today I hope to make you aware not only about IP, but how licensing and how you can apply it as part of the strategy. And Bill today was talking to you about a project you're working on in the world of cannabis. The world of cannabis is a very dynamic world where intellectual property and licensing is right at the core. It's a hot button. There is licensing going on in there every day, but it's a very unique case study to see what's happening there. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but licensing is being used as a strategy to get around some of the biggest hurdles, and one of those being that cannabis is not approved in the United States. It's a state-by-state basis, so you can't operate nationally, and in many cases internationally. So today what I'm going to cover is give you a little bit more information about myself, talk about IP and innovation, because it really is about innovation, what is licensing, how it works, and then wrap it up. First, I'll get started with my background. How I got started was in the movie business. I got started back in the days of Warner Brothers when they had the first Batman movie. I know that probably dates all of you. But it was at a time when licensing really was not at the front end of the movie business. It was the back end of the movie business. Studios in those days did not have much of a business at all when it comes to making the toys, t-shirts, hats, games, and everything else that you see come out about around movies. And the movie business has really changed. In those days, it was about producing a movie, selling tickets, distributing it through movie theaters, syndicating it on cable TV, and oh yeah, by the way, there is maybe some merchandise on the back end. Anybody know how Lucas made all of his billions of dollars? Star Wars. You know how he made it off of Star Wars? The first movies were produced by Fox. Guess what Fox didn't want and wasn't interested in?
Intellectual property.
The merchandise rights on the back end. Lucas kept them all. Fast forward, he wound up developing that and creating hundreds of millions of dollars. When he came out with the second trilogy, the first thing they did is went back and did a relicensing program on the original Star Wars and did another $250 million in merchandise sales before even the new trilogy came out. That's just an example of what has happened in the industry. Today, of course, it's all about the merchandise rights. You look at movies, TV shows, video games, everything else, they're nothing but an advertising for a lot of the cool stuff that you buy, your backpacks, hats, t-shirts, and everything else that comes down. So that's how I got my start. In those days, there were no people trained in licensing because the industry really didn't exist. And when I started there, it was really a phone call from somebody. I got a degree in advertising, started in advertising, discovered that's not what I wanted to do. Somebody I worked with called me up, said, how'd you like coming to the movie studios? Sure, who wouldn't? Went over there, got hired, put me in an office with a phone and said, go find some companies who want to take a chance on this movie we've got called Batman, but we don't think anybody's interested in it. That's why we shipped it off to England, because we're terrified that nobody is going to want to buy a ticket to see something that hasn't been around for 30 years. And I said, that sounds great. What's licensing? That's how literally I got my start. Basically what happened from there, the companies that were either too smart or too stupid came in, and for about $5,000 they got a license to the Batman movie. When the movie came out, of course, it went like a bat out of hell, and a lot of things changed very quickly, and now it's become a multi-billion-dollar franchise along with a lot of other movies that you see out there today. And so merchandise is at the forefront now of the entertainment business. My company today, operate as a licensing consultant and agent. I represent clients and helping them with their intellectual property, whether it's strategy consulting, a lot of managing the licensing program, the process, the campaign, the strategy, what it is, reaching out, putting the deals together, and making sure everything runs smoothly and we collect the money. That's primarily what I do. I work with a variety of different clients in many, many different categories. Today, innovation and IP is coming out of the woodwork. A lot of that is because around the world they've recognized intellectual property really is the foundation for economic growth. I work on a variety of IP, a lot of in the medical device, but I work with an inventor who, believe it or not, improved the toilet. I created an anti-clogging toilet, industrial gas testing, blue light technology for toothbrushes, surgical devices, medical slings and braces, things of that nature. So a lot of this technology is coming out very quickly. As you had talked about in your presentation, you talked about the technology and how quickly it's evolving. That's one of the biggest challenges that exists today. And it's creating some big challenges for companies, especially when it comes to getting that technology patenting. You get a patent for 20 years, but you're lucky if you've got a 5-year economic lifespan with your technology anymore. That's because so much new technology is coming into the market, not only from the United States, but Asia, Central, South America, Eastern Europe. They're all hotbeds. India, because everybody now is in the intellectual property game. They've gotten their IP laws together. It's called harmonization. They're trying to level the playing field for everybody. It's a big bone of contention for the negotiations that are going on. If you follow it all about what's called the TRIPS agreements, TPP, I know it's high-end political conversation and treaties, but what they're trying to do is figure out a way around the world to make it an even playing field for everybody. So intellectual property is at the forefront. Quick history lesson. IP goes way back, even beyond the Constitution, but it's actually written into the Constitution. Intellectual property is part of the United States Constitution because one of the founding fathers were inventors themselves. They used it because they knew the importance of protecting artistic creation and inventions. But before that, it was in England, and it dated back hundreds of years before that. There's a term in licensing called royalty, royalties that are paid. Well, that came from hundreds of years ago when the kings in these countries in Europe decided that they wanted to give a monopoly to the glass blower or to the artisan. So they gave them what was called a commission, a royalty commission, and in return they paid for that monopoly. That's where the term royalty came from, and now it's the term used to pay for the rights to use somebody's IP. So Thomas Jefferson was the first head of the IP office, and then later went on to be a president of the United States. And today what you see, as I mentioned earlier on, that wealth is being built on top of intellectual property, and it's really been a shift. When you go back, interestingly enough, there was some of the most significant inventions that occurred for thousands of years were the printing press, among others, but there wasn't any real innovation until the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. And what happened is the steam engine was built. And from there, it skyrocketed. Everything built on top of everything. And as you move forward and see, in the 50s, it used to be oil and tangible things, mining. Today, it's all about information and IP. Some of the biggest companies today that you're familiar with, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, this is all intellectual property. These companies don't make anything. So the economy that you're competing in today is one that's called innovation. It's about ideas, capital, knowledge. You have pointed that out in the strategy. That's what it's all about, is knowledge. And think about this. Everything you wear, sit in, eat, drive in, listen to, work on is all intellectual property. All of it. That phone that you have is nothing but bundles of intellectual property. The cars you drive in are bundles of intellectual property, and everybody is paying everybody royalties. Believe it or not, you have competitors like Apple and Ericsson and Samsung, and you think that they're all beating themselves up, but they're also each paying each other royalties on their sales. Because there's so many components, so many technologies inside of these devices that are owned that they have to form pools to make sure that they're able to do it without suing each other. They still sue each other. That still happens, but the point is, so much technology is coming out, they have to create some kind of agreement so that they're able to move forward. So the next time that you put on your t-shirt with Daffy Duck on it or get in your car, think of it as not a t-shirt, but as a piece of intellectual property. So what is IP? There's the most common forms of trademarks, copyrights, and patents, but there's two things to understand about intellectual property today. There's the registered side, which is patents, trademarks, and copyrights, where you fill it out, you go to a government agency, and you get a document that says you own it. Then there's the unregistered side, which is the know-how and trade secrets. Know-how and trade secrets is information such as source code, recipes, formulations like Coca-Cola, algorithms like the Google search engine. These are trade secrets that are becoming even more valuable than patents and trademarks, because so much of today's technology, so much of today's economy, so much of today's business is built on these trade secrets. In fact, there's very huge trade secret litigation that goes on over employees that walk out with customer lists, source codes, and everything else and take it to the competitor, who in turn use it. So keep in mind that there's a lot of intellectual property that you may not even be aware of. This includes marketing. If you build a website, you've got intellectual property. Customer, if you've got a customer list, it's intellectual property. Artistic, if you create artwork or photography. Contracts, any contracts that you make with employees or with suppliers. And of course, technology, source code, circuitry, things like that. So it's a big world. Intellectual property is a big world and covers just about everything. Is this making sense? I just want to stop because I know I'm covering a lot of ground really quick, but I want to make sure I get through it. So,
Maybe we can talk a little bit about how Bill Gates.
I'm going to share that story.
Okay.
Okay?
Good.
So what you have today is that IP rights are worth more than the value of the product. A product is sold for a certain price, but inside that product are IP rights. That's what comprises the value, not that end product. It's the patents, trade secrets, registered designs, and trademarks. When you look at acquisitions that have happened in the last 10 years where companies have paid hundreds of millions, if not billions, they're not buying the building, they're not buying the manufacturing equipment, they're not buying the raw materials, they're not buying the inventory. What they are buying is the intellectual property, the patents, because that is what gives them a competitive advantage, that's what gives them exclusivity, that's what gives them something to go after the competition with, that's what gives them rights to be able to make things. That's the essence of most companies today. And it's big news. If you're not paying attention, look around in the Wall Street Journal. I know you read the Wall Street Journal. They have a column on the blog. But it's big news because IP is everywhere now. And people are aware of it, even to the point of just the other day in my blog, I write a blog and I'm preparing an article. Columbia College, which one is it in Chicago? I think it's Columbia College. Anyway, they're having to come up with an intellectual property policy for the students who attend to get rights to be able to use their materials that they create, whether it's film, video, books, in the promotional materials that they use to promote to have students come to the school. Well, this has never been done before. There is no IP and intellectual licensing policy for schools. I don't think at UCI, when you came here and admitted there was a work for hire agreement you had to sign regarding your intellectual property. There's not, but there may be in the future, because this is what's happening. They recognize that intellectual property is taking all forms. So if you ever want to get an idea of what's happening, just look at the news, because it's coming in from everywhere. And it's what's created the biggest value for the companies is their intellectual property. Look at any company today, it's all about their IP. You name the company, it's either their brand, it's either their technology, or it's both, but it's all about intellectual property. And the statistics come out, I won't bore you with all of them, but needless to say that the bulk of value today, over 80% of every company, especially on the S&P 500, these big multinationals, it's all intellectual property, intellectual assets. It's not the plant and equipment, not the tangible stuff you can touch and feel. So let's talk about, and I want to get into licensing now and the impact it is, but the first thing I want you to understand, because a lot of you are going to go out and start up, is everything in your startup is IP. Everything in a startup, from your business plan, your marketing plan, and that's one of the most important things to understand. Where startups get tripped up a lot of times is they create intellectual property, they don't even know they have it, they go out to market, and then they lose it. So one of the first things to understand is it's a startup. And why is it so valuable to startups? You look around for investors today, you're working on a company today. That company has intellectual property. That's what you're going to be marketing. That's what you're applying your strategy to for the products. Today, investors want intellectual property. They look for company with intellectual property. It gives them higher valuation. It gives them something to work with. It gives you a competitive advantage. It sets you apart. And it sometimes is what saves the startup in the event they get into trouble. And so licensing is a strategy. And it's a strategy that you use where you're creating a plan of action of how you're going to put your intellectual property to work in the marketplace, beyond just making a product or service. But keep in mind, it's a process. It doesn't just start with a strategy and say, we're going to go do this and it ends. It's a process, just like you have a marketing planning process, a business planning process, an operational process. It's a process that takes your IP, figures out how you're going to transform it into something, products, services, technology, and then create revenue with it. And that's done through this process that involves many of the same things you're already talking about and learning about in strategy. Many of the same planning components, from the corporate to the business to the functional. What is licensable? Well, what makes IP valuable license? Is it better? Does it do something better? Is it cheaper? Is it faster? And does it have a patent? And if you look around at things that today, it's always about better, faster, cheaper, or patented. That's generally what it comes down to. If you can save money, increase profit. That's what IP is all about. That's what makes it licensable. Why do companies want a license? For that reason. They either want to make more money, drive down costs, or get something that their competitors don't have. And how are rights licensed? The one thing about intellectual property, it's a very versatile type of asset. There's many ways that you can license it. Four of the most common ways are to license everything, which is to make, use, and sell, or just the distribution, just the sales, just the use of it, and all sorts of interesting hybrids that go on in there. I know a lot of this is probably a lot of information hitting you in a little advance, but I want you to get a sense of what you can do with IP, because it's something that it really isn't thought about, but it is one of the most versatile assets. By the way, it's a big challenge for a lot of companies in figuring out how to value IP, because they carry it on the books, but it's always lumped in with goodwill, but it's actually a lot more valuable than that. And licensing agreements are much like real estate, okay? There's different types of licensing agreements. There's agreements for patents, there's agreements for trademarks and copyrights, and there's agreements for trade secrets and know-how. Where people get in a lot of trouble is they use the wrong agreements, or they include the wrong terms. It's like going out to rent your house, but you use a commercial office building rental agreement. That's not going to work too well. Well, the same thing exists in licensing. You got to use the right type of agreement, and you got to use the right language. And in a lot of ways it's very similar, because when we talk about intellectual property, it's what's called intangible property. When you talk about real estate, it's called real property. But in many ways they operate very similar, and the industries are very similar. But again, because it's not something that's talked about, you don't learn about it a lot, so it's not really common knowledge, but you find that they do operate in a very similar way. And as I had said, every major company today and smaller businesses are using licensing. Okay, it's a big part of their strategy, a big part of their revenue. For many businesses today, it is their revenue model. Okay, especially those that have fallen on hard times, gone bankrupt, and had to reinvent themselves, like Kodak. They reinvent themselves as an innovation company because the value that the investors realized is their patent portfolio. So let's talk about Bill. You know who Bill is? Bill Gates, you ever heard of him? Okay. Well, I want to talk about Bill and IBM. Bill, when he got his start, he didn't have any money. He didn't have a market, he didn't have an office, he had nothing. But he had an idea. And his idea was, if I could get IBM to use my operating system, I'll bet I could launch it in a big way. So that's exactly what Bill did, is he used licensing to launch his startup. He went to IBM, who had that clunker you see there, and said, look, your operating system really sucks for the consumer. They aren't going to like to use it, but what if I were able to design a system that was really easy to use? Would you be interested? And they said yes. So Bill went out and found another company that had developed part of the operating system and licensed rights for them, built upon it, and then relicensed it to IBM. So let me ask you a question. How much was that IBM licensing deal worth to Bill? $350 million. That's his take when they went public 6 years later off of that licensing deal. The reason they went public is when he did the licensing deal with IBM, they installed Windows in every computer they sold. But guess what Bill did in his licensing deal? He carved something out. What he did is he said, look, I'm going to give you the rights to sell it with my operating system, but I'm carving out rights to be able to sell the operating system separately under the Windows brand, which is what you can do with licensing. Well, guess what happened as people were using those computers and Bill upgraded the software? Well, they all had to go to Bill to get the upgrade. And eventually what happened as the software evolved, Bill's company grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew till it went public to over $350 million for Bill, but probably close to $1 billion with the public offering off of a licensing deal. So licensing is a very powerful strategy, and I share that story because most people aren't familiar with it. Yet it's the way that one of the most wealthiest and most successful companies got its start. Here's another story I want to share with you. Everybody familiar with Larry and Sergey? Of course, you got to be familiar with Google. Well, they went to Stanford. And while they were at Stanford, they were developing an algorithm. So they finished at Stanford, and guess what they decided to do? They went to Stanford and they said, we want to license that algorithm and take it to the market and create something for the internet called a search engine. Stanford said, sure. Why don't you give us stock in their company? So in return, Stanford licensed it to Sergey and to Larry. So what do you think that Stanford's deal is worth today? Remember, they got 1.8 million shares back when Google was just Google. Over $2 billion. Just Stanford's portion of this. If you know what Google stock is, it's $1,200. That was a licensing deal. Okay? See, licensing works both ways, in and out. So as an entrepreneur, as a startup, you don't necessarily have to invent anything. You can go and acquire. You're sitting at one of the top 10 universities in the country that has a huge technology transfer office with tremendous IP sitting there, waiting for startups to license it. And they give the inside track to alumni and students. So licensing is a very powerful strategy. That's why I share these with you, so that you can get an idea of what occurs. When I was licensing at the studios and these small companies came in to get a license on Batman, I also worked on Power Rangers, and they got in there early. They got a license that was maybe $5,000. 1 year later, when that movie hit, they were literally making millions of dollars. And in some cases, I saw companies go from 0 to multi-million and become millionaires in 2 years because they were selling so much off of the merchandise being sold and the power of that going in the market. Of course, when you have 50 million kids all wanting the same thing at the same time, you can make a lot of money really quick. Okay, these are just very large examples of what can occur with licensing, and I like to share those just to give you an idea of what the impact. Of course, there's a lot smaller deals that don't quite make as much, but the point is it's all about the intellectual property. So when is the right time to license? If you have intellectual property, the most important thing you can do is build it, test it, and validate it. Validate it. Does somebody want it? Will they buy it? Will they use it? Does it work? At that point, then, you could start going to the market and finding partners. And just like you just, and by the way, when you use licensing, licensing is an either or. It's part of your business strategy. If you've got a product or a technology that has multiple markets to go after, but you've only got the money and the resources to go after one, use licensing to go after the other markets. That's what Bill did. He let IBM take it into the computer market while he just focused on the software and the upgrades. You can do the same thing. And as part of your strategy, it can be very effective because then you don't have to leave those markets open for the competition. Because believe me, if you're successful in one market and you've got other market applications and you're not there, somebody else will be there. So when should you consider licensing? Usually if you've got to raise a lot of capital and it's very intensive, if you're up against big competition like in the healthcare industry, if you lack the resources, which a lot of startups do, it's very hard to have all the money, manpower, and resources you need. And here's an important one. If you have an incremental technology versus a disruptive, does everybody know the difference? Okay? You should be aware of the difference. Disruptive is like a Google or a Facebook. Okay? Those are more the exceptions than the norm. 90%, 95% of most new innovations, new IP that comes out is incremental, meaning you improve something, a product, a service, a technology, a process, a system. And if it's incremental, more than likely there's somebody out there today that's already established in the market who can use that technology and it fits well for them and they can run with it. So if you really do have an incremental, be sure that you understand the difference between an incremental and disruptive, because many startups today have an incremental technology that they think is disruptive, and it's really not. You really have to take a look at your market and understand where your technology fits, and then do your homework on the competition, because there's a lot that's coming in very quickly, and you have to really be aware. So if it is incremental, licensing is a great option for you. So summing it up, innovation and IP. IP is the oil of the global economy. It's all about the strategy. It is, and every business is in the IP business. Okay, whether they realize it or not, they are in the IP business, and licensing is a strategy. It's a strategy you can use today and be part of every business today, even the projects you're working going forward. So that concludes the presentation. I offer a newsletter. You're welcome to go to my website and sign up for my newsletter. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you got learned a little something. And now I'd like to open up to questions.
Is there anything stopping someone from licensing something that's too general?
Too general?
Yeah, like an extreme example, like let's say if someone like licenses or wants to license phone cases with plastic or something, like that's too general. Is there
You could do it. I mean, if they wanted to license it and it was something general, sure. Why? I mean, you can basically license anything today, but obviously it's got to have some IP behind it and make sense from a licensing standpoint.
Do you recommend a law degree if you wanted to go into this field?
Only, well, if you want to work on the legal side of licensing, I'm on the business development side. My focus is on strategy, consulting, getting the deals done. I work with a lot of IP attorneys that are contract attorneys. In fact, we talk a lot because they don't do the business development. The business development side is the one of figuring out the strategy and then going out and reaching out to companies to see if they would be interested in licensing. It's a very challenging. There's so much IP is the biggest asset in the world. There's more IP than anything else in the world. And it's a very challenging market. I mean, universities sit on billions, corporations sit on billions, not to mention the millions of companies and startups that are inventing it. And the challenge today is how do you take all this IP and really bring it to market? Because only a very small percentage of it is reaching the market in the form of products, services, and technologies. A big chunk of it lies dormant. Now, some of it isn't the greatest, because if you ever go through the patent databases, you'll see some pretty wacky inventions that just don't have any commercial application. But a lot of it sits dormant because of inventors and businesses that just don't understand how to put their IP to work through the licensing process. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Oh, one more? Was there one more?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
What are some like interesting like licensing cases that you work on besides like Batman?
Interesting?
Yeah.
Are you talking about as in wild stories or?
Anything that was like very interesting to you that you didn't discuss?
Well, I mean, I think every deal is always interesting. I'm always amazed when I go out into the market. A lot of my businesses are small businesses, inventors, going to these larger companies and interacting with them, because many of these companies today, even though they're very large, they don't even understand intellectual property and the intake. And so you have a lot of really interesting situations that occur with them as you bring this intellectual property to them. In most cases, I find that companies are more secure in their own IP than looking at outside IP, but they do want outside IP. But with that said, I think the interesting things that occur is just the way that the IP evolves and moves through. In the entertainment business, it's crazy simply because companies come to you and they think of all sorts of wacky ideas to get that license and go out to the market with it, because kids consume it at a different level. But adults and more sophisticated technologies are a lot more challenging. I'd say some of the patents are very interesting because of the situation that occurs with the claims, and I don't want to get into the details there, but there's a lot of crossover, and sometimes you can run into situations where companies see the technology and don't want to do anything because they think it might be infringing on something else. And a lot of that is because there's just too much information out there. Does that kind of answer your question?
Ram, maybe we could talk a little bit about the dollars and cents. So as somebody, let's say one of my students creates a type of software that wants to be licensed, as they license it out, what can they expect to get in from? Is it a 4%? Is it 20%?
That's a good point. I'd say, the industry average is 5%, but it varies. I mean, in the entertainment business, when you got into toys and t-shirts and things like that, it got up to 8, 12%. There's other situations where it's 3 to 5%. The smartphone industry, for example, is an interesting industry. On smartphones, they pay 3 to 5% royalties to the holders of all the technologies that are inside those phones. Okay, as an example. Smart cars are coming down the pipeline. And so they're creating what's called a patent pool of the companies, especially cellular technologies, 4G, 5G, calling technologies that they're integrating into. I mean, the cars are basically becoming smart cars. They're going to be like your smartphone. They're just going to have all this. So they're going to pay anywhere from $8 to $15 per vehicle sold to use this technology. So it varies. And in some cases, there's royalties that can go high as 30, 40, even 50%. Depending on what the profit margins and how you want to use the revenue split. Another form of licensing, just so that you're aware of it, is franchising. You hear about a franchise. A franchise is a business opportunity like a fast food restaurant or a yogurt shop or whatever it is. The difference is that it's regulated by the federal government, the SEC, because it's what's known as a business opportunity where you have to buy in and spend money to set up and follow their procedures. But inside that franchise agreement is a licensing agreement giving you the right to use their procedures, logos, everything else like that.
So for example, like if the Starbucks is on campus, like they have different drinks, like if you want to get a refill, say remember you want to get a refill, like that doesn't matter on campus, you just have to pay like 50 cents or $50 or something like that. And if that's a receipt, how come they cut out a deal with like universities different than like other Starbucks like off campus?
Why do they have a different deal?
Yeah,
Probably to give them access to the university campus.
so it's more of a benefit to Starbucks than to the university.
Well, sure, because it exposes you, you get hooked on Starbucks coffee, and when you go out and make a lot of money, you spend a lot of money on Starbucks coffee. But, I mean, I say that jokingly, but it's true. But Starbucks, by the way, did one of the largest licensing deals in the world, worth several $1 billion with Nestle, to take out the Starbucks brand under a whole host of products. That's how valuable that brand became. We're talking billions of dollars, one of the largest in the world, because it's so well known. And, you know, Starbucks is a big brand play, as is McDonald's, as is a lot of these companies. Coca-Cola has a huge licensing program. So the value of their IP has increased so much that they can really use it to generate a lot more business than they can selling products direct in some cases. Okay?
Maybe we can just wrap it up with one thing. So about a year ago, maybe it was even longer than that, I think I introduced a deal to Rand. And remember Ro with the... with the yeah.
detector.
Yeah, so he had this detector, this gentleman, that if you put it into the wall here, it could detect if there was any mold or mildew behind the wall, which is a phenomenal, situation. But as an entrepreneur, this guy could not give up control. He had to
That's a good point.
he had to he thought he was going to manufacture 10,000 of them and give them to, basically buildings and so on and so forth and do it himself. The biggest mistake in the world. I said, that's moronic. This product could be used all over the world, so why wouldn't you license it? So I introduced them to Rand and Rand found out, but we never talked about this, but it was like the guy was out of his mind.
And actually, Bill raises a good point, because I do run into many, many startups. The idea is I'm gonna start a business and I'm gonna go this direction. I'm gonna make it myself. I'm gonna build it and create a company. But you know how tough that is. The odds are against you. 8 out of 10 businesses are going to fail in the first 5 years. But licensing is many times a strategy you can get to market faster, and it's smarter. I mean, it's the old, why reinvent the wheel if the wheel's already rolling? And, sometimes you got to get your ego out of the way to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, what he needed to do was go to somebody with an international footprint that could have immediate distribution. It wasn't like go build, 5,000 and test the market. So anyway, I think we're wrapping it up.
Okay. All right. Thanks again.